What is up, duelists? I am coming to you today with potentially the most important video we have uploaded to this channel thus far. This is the Edison rulings roundup video, and where I'm going to cover a bunch of different Edison erratas and common rulings and card interactions that you might be unfamiliar with, but that all come up pretty frequently in competitive play. A lot of these cards have had updates to their effect or global rule changes since 2010, so it can be really confusing to try to backtrack when we play this 2010 format to understand what the rulings were at that time and what the card effects were at that time. We try to play in our tournaments and in our ranked play as accurate to 2010, as in if you entered a tournament at that time, what the common rulings and card effects would be understood as we possibly can. If you're familiar with GOAT format, you know they do the same. So without further ado, I'd like to get into this video and cover as much ground as I possibly can with the most common card interactions that you're going to see come up, whether you're playing it ranked or even in casual games with your friends. You're probably going to come across these cards. Quick disclaimer, this video is going to be a little long. I hope you guys can use it as a valuable resource, but there's a decent chance that either we're going to find new information or I might just have a brief oversight on something. I've really done a lot of work to make this as clear and concise as possible. But if we do get something wrong, we're going to try to add a note in it to not confuse anyone or add a comment. And just bear with us, this is take one at trying to create a unified ruling understanding for everyone. So let's get right into it. The first topic we're going to cover is these 7 erratas of really common cards that you see on the screen. Sangan, Goyo Guardian, Brionic, Rescue Cat, Red Eyes Darkest Metal Dragon, Future Fusion, Brain Control. And all of these cards had erratas or updates to their effect since 2010 that most of them really fundamentally changed the way that they are played. For example, in Edison format, Goyo is a generic synchro, so it can be made with any tuner and non-tuner, that total level 6. But later on, it was updated to have, I believe, a Earth non-tuner. So when we play in 2010, we treat it just like it was in 2010, that you can use any tuner and non-tuner to create it. Now, other cards that have these erratas are Brionic, which let you bounce any card in the field, not just your opponent's, and it's also not once per turn. Rescue Cat, the monsters it summons, can get their effects, which is a core component to the Rescue Cat combo decks. Red Eyes Darkest Metal is not hard once per turn, and you can banish other copies of itself to special summon it. Future Fusion, this is one of the more different ones. So you reveal the fusion monster at Future Fusion's activation, and you send the materials then, and then it gets summoned in 2 turns. The new one is much more confusing with the kind of staggered send and reveal, but in 2010, this is how we play it. Sangan can activate the monster that you search that turn, and Brain Control can take any face-up monster, not just normal summoned ones. So if you're playing it unlimited on Dueling Book, which is usually what we have to do since we don't have the rank ladder yet, you're going to see these updated and for our purposes incorrect versions of these effects because of course it's unlimited. They're using all eras, the most updated versions. But this creates a lot of ruling disputes with small changes to the cards. So if you ever get into one of these kind of things, you could send them this video or just know that you're using the 2010 version of that card effect. And with that, let's get into the next section, which is Ryko. If you've played the format, you're almost definitely familiar with this card because it's one of the most popular cards in many top tier strategies. But there's a key difference in how Ryko works now and how it worked in 2010. That being that the 2010 version of Ryko has a kind of sequential effect where it targets a monster on the field, it destroys it, and then it mills. And of course, the destruction is optional. You can always choose just to mill. Whereas the new Ryko does not target, and it destroys and mills at the same time. Now, this functionally changes a few different interactions because with the old version of Ryko, if you destroy an optional trigger monster like Dimensional Alchemist or Dupe Frog, they will not get their effects. They'll miss the timing because the destruction and the mill happens immediately after, so they miss the timing since the destruction wasn't the last thing to happen. For more information about these kind of global rulings, you really have to dig a little deeper, and that would be too much to cover right now, but basically because they're optional effects, they're going to miss the timing. And for a broader overview of these kind of Yu-Gi-Oh rules, you could probably find a forum post or just do some Google search on Wiki. It's also worth mentioning the Ryko interactions with Blackwing Shura. Ryko will destroy Shura before it can trigger its effect, since it needs to remain face up on the field to kind of check it destroyed a monster by battle and send it to the graveyard. A notable kind of difference is a card like X-Saber Fullhelm Knight. These cards seem very similar, Shura and Fullhelm, but if you read Fullhelm, it does not have to send the monster to the graveyard to trigger its effect. So it checks at a different timing window than Shura, which means that even if Fullhelm destroys a Ryko by battle and Ryko chooses to pop the Fullhelm, you'll still be able to activate Fullhelm's effect because it doesn't essentially have to remain face up on the field like Shura does. But what's also interesting here is that if Ryko were to destroy the Fullhelm, Fullhelm could activate and target itself, the same card that got sent to the graveyard, and just revive itself. So if that's the situation you ever find yourself caught in, it might be a good decision not to destroy the Fullhelm, just so they won't be able to get it right back on the field and hit you for another 1300. So these are common interactions with Ryko. Again, kind of confusing given the updated text, but definitely worth talking about just given that this is such a popular card in the format. Next up, we have Frog Stuff. This is going to be a shorter one, but given that these cards have so many effects and just seem to be so confusing to so many players, I thought it was worth mentioning. Dupe Frog cannot search Substitoad. Substitoad can also not search Substitoad. You can't tribute another monster on the field to special summon a Substitoad from your deck. Nowhere in Substitoad's name is the word frog, so therefore it is not a frog. And there are these kind of like dupe lock interactions. If you have two dupe frogs on the field, they can't attack any. If you have another Substitoad, they can't be destroyed by battle. But that really just comes from reading the card. The other important thing to note, that I believe this is an errata as well, but Swap Frog can only gain you one additional frog summon per turn. But you can trigger its effect as a cost to return itself or return another monster as many times as you want. So even though you're only gaining one additional summon, you could, if you wanted to, keep special summoning it and bouncing it back to your hand or bounce another monster. But the important thing to remember is that you're only gaining one additional summon, and even though you're essentially using the effect for no gain, you can still use that to bounce it to its hand. One other thing I didn't mention here is that Treeborn Frog is not a once per turn. I know on the new printings they say once per turn. But yeah, I mean, this comes up with enemy controller or just trying to bring it back a bunch of times under Light and Darkness Dragon, things like this. So you can definitely bring back Treeborn Frog multiple times in the standby phase, despite that wording on it. Next up, Royal Oppression. Very confusing card, was changed a few times over the years. In, I believe, 2008, it got a change to all continuous with these kind of trigger type effects that you can flip them and use them on the same chain. If you're familiar with something like GOAT format, you would know that this is why Royal Oppression is not a super commonly played card, because prior to 2008, if you flip you'd have to flip a Royal Oppression before an opponent special summons, essentially, and then you would be able to negate it. But if they were just to do something like slam down a Chaos Sorcerer, you try to flip over your Oppression, well, the monster's already been summoned and you can't just pay 800 there. However, in Edison format, what we're talking about, that is not the case. You can activate Royal Oppression in response to card effects that special summon, like Call of the Haunted, or summons themselves, like Cyber Dragons and Chaos Sorcerers, even monster effects that are already face up on the field, like a Lumina or a Zombie Master. What's important to remember, though, is you can just flip it up and pay 800 right there, and it'll negate and destroy that card. What's important to remember is that first time you're flipping it up, say again, they summon a Cyber Dragon, you flip up Royal Oppression, you can't use it multiple times in that first activation. So you pay your 800, it would negate the Cyber Dragon, but if, say, your opponent were to chain a Call of the Haunted there to make sure they have a bigger monster on the field, you would not be able to use Oppression a second time right there if they did it on the chain. Don't really ask me why that is. It's just because the card is initially being activated and you can't use it twice there. If they wait till it's already resolved, then Oppression can be used multiple times on the chain. If it's already been face up, that interaction that I just described would be fine. You could negate the Call of the Haunted or whatever chain link 2 or 3 higher special summon effect they would be trying to use, as long as Royal Oppression was already face up. It does not work under Cold Wave. Cold Wave prevents activations even of face up spell or trap effects. It does not work in the damage step, meaning when you try to special summon something like a Gores or attack over a Mystic Tomato, anything like this, you will not be able to Royal Oppression. If its initial activation is negated, say by something like a Solemn Judgment, you'll still pay 800. That is still just an activation cost, even though it's a continuous effect. It can be used on these cards that are optional special summons, like Starlight Road and Macrocosmos, even if they didn't have an extra deck and weren't trying to summon a Stardust Dragon, you could still Royal Oppression the Starlight Road because it has that special summoning effect. Drill Warrior is not exactly the same as these, but it's just important to note that if Drill Warrior is banished and its effect is activating to return it to play, you can Royal Oppression that and it would just stay banished. Kind of in regards to the initial errata that we mentioned, the Future Fusion interaction with Royal Oppression, you would have to use it on Future Fusion's initial activation, i.e. when they reveal a card from their extra deck, you flip Royal Oppression there, and they will not send anything from their deck. If you wait, or if you draw it late, and they go to special summon their 5-head dragon or Absolute Zero, whatever, that will be too late, and by the time that second standby phase rolls around, you won't be able to Royal Oppression on that summon. It's also just important to note, and this is the deck that I play, that when you activate something like a Vayu or even a Treeborn Frog graveyard effect, those are not costs value. So if you were to flip an Oppression there, you're not going to be able to do much because the materials are going to stay in the graveyard. You're going to pay 800 for nothing, and then they could just use the effect again since the cards are all still in the graveyard. So that's why the Vayu deck is able to effectively use Royal Oppression itself, because they can still summon their Vayu guys under the Oppression. And that about rounds up Royal Oppression. Terrifying card to play against, but once you have this knowledge, it'll become a little more straightforward. Next up, this is just a general overview of what I understand some common ruling changes to be between GOAT format, which I also play quite a bit, Edison format, 2010, and current format. Now, this is far from exhaustive, and this is definitely an area that I could stand to learn a little more. But one thing that I wanted to mention is that in Edison format, basically the way replays work, which is when the attack targets on your opponent's side of the field change during the declaration or battle step, you kind of rewind to the attack declaration, and the same monster must either redeclare attack or it cannot attack at all. A good example of this might be if you have a Berserk Gorilla on the field and a DD Warrior Lady. If you attack with a Berserk Gorilla, they call the Haunted, get back a Cyber Dragon. Now, let's not use Berserk Gorilla. Let's use a Skilled Dark Magician or something like this, because Berserk Gorilla is always going to have to attack anyway. But your Skilled Dark Magician would have an opportunity to redeclare an attack on the Cyber Dragon. But what you'd probably want to do right is have your DD Warrior Lady banish the Cyber Dragon and then attack direct with a Skilled Dark Magician. Now, in GOAT format, that is actually a perfectly legal play to do. The replay happens, you can redeclare an attack with a separate monster, DD Warrior Lady, and then attack directly. In Edison format, that is not a legal play. You either choose, if you're going to redeclare with the Skilled Dark Magician, which you wouldn't want to do, or it's considered already attacked. So you could still crash with the DD Warrior Lady, but you wouldn't be able to attack directly with the Skilled Dark. It would just be forced to not attack at all since it already declared once. As far as I understand, that's the same ruling in current, but it's an important thing to note, especially if you play both of these at retro formats, because it can come up. Now, in GOAT format and Edison, you have no extra deck zone. There's no restrictions on what extra deck monsters, in this case only fusions and synchros, you can really play. And I know that in current, you have this separate extra deck zone, you have the links and the pointing. I don't really understand this too much, but just suffice to say that despite what Dueling Book might have on the unlimited section, we don't play by any of those rules, and you can summon synchro and fusion monsters to any zone you like. In GOAT and Edison format, you have something called priority. Priority is way too complicated to explain in full in this video, but basically you can activate ignition effects from monsters upon the moment they're summoned. So something like a Bottomless Trap Hole, Torrential Tribute are not going to stop those effects from being activated. Now, in current, and I believe after 2012, the priority ceased to exist because it was kind of a ruling's nightmare. But as we are playing in 2010, once again, we are going to play by those priority rulings. So if you summon a Chaos Sorcerer, you have call priority, banish their monster, they can use Bottomless, their monster's still going to be banished. I know there's a few other differences here. As always, if you want to chime in the comments about things that we've missed, I guess even if they're really arcane, although I would try to keep it to things that are going to come up in actual competitive play. But yeah, please let me know. And if we ever make an updated version, I'll be sure to include them. Next up, Drill Warrior. Drill Warrior is just kind of a confusing card with a lot of effects. So its effect to discard a card from your hand once it's summoned and you would try to banish itself is not a cost. So it's not, a condition to activate it that you pitch a card first. You would just declare the effect and see if they have a response. But if you use something like a Fiendish Chain or, anything that negates effects, obviously you're not going to have them discard because it's not a cost. However, where it gets a little confusing and why this is worth mentioning is that effects that might be chained to remove a Drill Warrior from the game, say, Compulsory Evacuation Device or a Phoenix Wing Wind Blast, Regeki Break, these type of card effects, the drill is going to still resolve as much as possible. So you're still going to end up discarding even though it's not a cost. A notable kind of exception to this is Book of Moon. Why this is the case, I'm not really sure, but if you activate Drill Warrior's effect, a Book of Moon is chained, you're going to discard, and the monster's your Drill Warrior is actually still going to be banished. This is just a weird loophole that existed back then, and I wouldn't read too much into it. All the other kinds of effects, your drill is not going to resolve because it's not face up on the field any longer. The returning effect in your standby phase cannot be bottomless or responded to with something like a torrential tribute, and also it does not target. It's all part of one effect, so you get it back and you get a card from the graveyard, and they don't really have a lot of opportunity to respond unless they're negating the effect while in the banish pile with something like the Royal Oppression, as mentioned, or GB Chariot. The targeting is relevant because, say they only had one monster in graveyard, you would need to crow that beforehand. You would probably do it on chain when they activate the banish Drill Warrior effect in their standby. So then they wouldn't have a target to get back. But if you've waited for them to get it back and then they're saying, hey, I'm going to take back my Dandelion or whatever the case may be, you don't really have an opportunity to crow there. You would have needed to use it beforehand. And if you did banish something and they had another monster in graveyard, they could select that and get it back instead. But it's kind of a hard card to interrupt in that way. And of course, this is maybe common sense to anyone that understands how chain links work, but when you summon it and you use its effect to half its attack points, that would not, prevent you from bottomlessing. You could just use bottomless as a higher chain link, and the effect to half has not resolved yet. So that about covers it for Drill Warrior. Again, a scary card, but once you understand its interactions, you'll be a lot more prepared to deal with it. Now here's a doozy. Necrovalley. I hate this card. I hated making this slide, but Necrovalley is by far one of the most confusing cards in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, I would say. And it's too much here to really discuss the different ways in which its effect has changed over the years. But what we can get into is its effect in Edison format, which reads as follows. Negate the effects of spells, traps, and effect monsters that target cards in either player's graveyard. Cards in either player's graveyard cannot be removed from play, and all Gravekeeper's monsters gain 500 attack and defense. Now, the best way to proceed with Necrovalley is just to read this very literally. It only stops targeting effects and the banish from either player's graveyard. So anything that doesn't target cards in the graveyard, but you might think gets stopped by Necrovalley, such as Rekindling, Errata's Darkest Metal, Goyo Guardian, Beckoning Light, these all do not target and will not be stopped by Necrovalley. Even though, yes, they're moving a card from the graveyard to a different place. Yeah, they're affecting the graveyard. Sure. In Edison format, they're not stopped by Necrovalley. And once you understand that, it's really quite simple. Anything like Treeborn Frog, would fall out of this card's negation abilities because it's not targeting a card. It's not removing anything from play. So it gets to summon itself just fine. And as always, it's going to boost those Gravekeepers by 500. But yeah, really you just got to take it quite literally and ask yourself, is this card targeting? Is this card banishing? No. Then it's not going to be negated by Necrovalley. And despite any updates, any erratas, different formats that Necrovalley has different effects in, that's how it works in Edison format. Now, winding down, this is just some good stuff to know. It's kind of a meme on our channel that Debris Dragon has to revive things in attack. I don't know why people get this wrong. Says it quite clearly on the card. But when you, get back your Dandelion, has to be in attack mode. Starlight Road, probably could have made a whole slide on Starlight Road, but it's important to note this one interaction that I think a lot of people don't know about. So say my opponent has 2 back row and I have my Heavy Storm. If I activate my Heavy Storm there, of course, they can use their Starlight Road. Now, what a lot of people don't know is that if I also have an MST in hand, I have kind of 2 options here. I could chain my MST, target their other back row, and that would resolve before the Stardust Dragon comes out. And this is all because Starlight Road is not a counter trap, despite its effect being kind of similar to one. And so they would get a Stardust Dragon, I would lose my 2 cards, but they're losing both their back row. So if you have another way to deal with the Stardust, that's a pretty common and good play. What you could also do is you could chain MST and target your own Heavy Storm. And now, at least in Edison format, Starlight Road needs to destroy the card that it's negating in order to summon that Stardust Dragon from its extra deck. So since MST destroyed Heavy Storm instead of Starlight Road, no Stardust Dragon would be summoned. And sure, they're going to get to keep one of their back rows because they did still negate the Storm effect, but one back row might be much easier to deal with in that circumstance than a big Stardust Dragon on the board. This is just a kind of helpful tip and trick that is maybe not so obvious and might not even be possible in later formats. I have no idea. Cards like Vanity's Fiend are going to stop you from even activating Future Fusion. This applies to other similar cards like Fossil Dyna and even to a Kawaki Mirror Drago if the card that you would be revealing for Future Fusion is a light or dark. Chimera Tech, kind of similar. You can't send their monsters under something like a Vanity's Fiend, but what you also can't do is send all these machine monsters to the graveyard under a Banisher or Defissure, because, to summon the Chimera Tech is sort of sending all the cards to the graveyard specifically is kind of an activation requirement or a condition in order to summon it. So since they can't be sent to the graveyard, you can't summon the Chimera Tech. This also goes for a card like Charge the Light Brigade, where since you can't mill these cards to the graveyard, it cannot be activated. And that is about all I have. I know we moved through this at kind of a breakneck pace, but I'm hoping that even if you're in a game right now, you can maybe scrub to the moment that you need and get an accurate ruling. Please comment below if I've gotten something egregiously wrong or if you have neat little tips and tricks, especially on this good stuff to know, small interactions. To me, I think sometimes it can be hard, since I know a lot of this stuff, to know what players do or don't know or what might be helpful. So if there's even more basic kind kind of dumbed down versions that would be helpful to players, please ask in the comments or help people. The only thing I would ask is if you're really not sure about a ruling, don't comment because that's going to create a lot more confusion. I mean, don't comment saying that you know what you're talking about. But we're going to do our best to respond to comments, and I'm going to link in description another document that was compiled by user Mika, that's also covering a lot of common ruling interactions that you could use as a resource if you're in games or playing with your friends. As always, this is just to play the most accurate version of Edison format we can and ensure that we're making consistent rulings in all future tournaments. So I hope you guys enjoyed and learned something and can show it to your friends who don't believe you about some obscure interaction in 2010 Yu-Gi-Oh! So with that, I'm going to call it a day, and peace, like, comment, subscribe, and thank you for watching.